Afternoon, everybody, and welcome. As I too see this crowd growing, it's kind of neat to look out there in this virtual land and see all these people. A lot to cover today, and I'm going to, I could probably talk for 12 hours on what I'm going to talk about and condense it down to an hour. But we're going to really concentrate on the develop module in Lightroom. And what's interesting is that a lot of it that people think they know how to use, they realize that they actually don't know as much as they thought, in part because there's a lot of stuff that just actually isn't documented. I was joking with Brian before we started that when all else fails, use the option key, because for so many of the features, the option key initiates other behavior that you wouldn't know about. So,
Hey, Seth,
yes.
if I can interrupt for a second, if you wouldn't mind, can you just try speaking a little louder? I think there are a few people who it's hard for them to hear.
I would be happy to talk a little louder. Is that better?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay. Now that I'm going to talk louder, so anyways, I am going to switch to the develop module. I'm currently in the library module. And I've made a selection of some specific images so that I can actually take you through what each of these different features do. And I want to start actually on the left-hand side. We'll let this load for a second here. And on the left-hand side of the develop module, we have presets. And presets, some that come with Lightroom, other ones that you can download. Actually, On One has an entire set of free presets that you can also download as well. To use a preset or to see how a develop preset looks, you can simply have the navigator opened up. You can open up the presets, and if you run your mouse over the presets, you'll see their effect in the navigator window, and then you could apply any preset simply by mousing down, and that will apply that look to the main image. So if I wanted to apply, for example, the infrared film grain look, mouse down, and now we have the look of infrared. A couple of other little basics before I get into the heart of this. The other thing that people ask a lot about with regards to making a change in Lightroom is that we are changing metadata. Lightroom is what's called parametric editing, meaning we are not editing or altering pixels. We are editing or altering metadata only. So in the develop module, there is history. Then history is always going to be saved for each and every image, even after the image is closed, unlike Photoshop. So to get back to where I was before I applied that preset, I can simply go back in history, or I can actually hit reset, which would take me back to the way the image was when it was imported. There's one other preset that comes with Lightroom that's actually very, very cool that people don't know about, and that's called zeroed out, or general zeroed. And general zeroed actually conceptually takes you back to the point before you even import it into Lightroom. Takes you back to, in essence, zeroing out all features even in camera. So one thing that I just point out is that for sometimes it may be worth it for you to experiment to go all the way back to actually pre-import, and you can do that with general zeroed. I have a bunch of user-defined presets that I make. Pretty much I missed my Kodachrome when Kodachrome disappeared, so I have a bunch of Kodachrome presets that apply different things that actually mimic the behavior with different cameras of Kodachrome. And again, I can apply those simply by mousing down on it, and then I can actually sync that look in the develop module, which I will show a little later on. So without further ado, let's go over to some of the other features. And I want to start with white balance. And just to make this simple, I'm going to close my other panels here so I don't confuse you guys. And I'm in the basic panel. And we can control white balance in several ways. Number one, there is a drop-down menu where we have predetermined presets based on the codec guide. So cloudy, for example, is 6500 Kelvin, daylight 5500, tungsten 2850, so on and so forth. That is one way, or as shot. The other way are with sliders. The slider, the first one, adding blue or cooling the image, moving it to the left, and moving it to the right, adding yellow or warming the image. Underneath that, we have a second slider called a tint slider, going to the left, adding green, and going to the right, adding magenta. The reason for the tint slider is that a lot of the engineers actually were, or still are, I should say, Canon users, and they noticed that in some of the early model Canon cameras, there tended to be a bit of a magenta tint. So the idea was that if you could add a little green, you could remove that tint. There is yet another way, and I think one of the things that's probably difficult to understand about Lightroom is that for every way of doing something, there are yet many other ways to do the same thing. I guess that's a feature of both Photoshop and Lightroom for that matter. So we also have a white balance tool, or white balance selector. I can mouse down on that. When I mouse down on the white balance selector, I open up automatically a toolbar for the white balance tool. And I just want to show you a couple things about that toolbar. The toolbar comes defaulted with auto dismiss on, which I find annoying, because that means that when as soon as I click and make an adjustment, it then switches into the zoom tool. So I like to actually keep the auto dismiss button in the toolbar off so that I can click in several places and get a white balance. That's number one. Number two, we have a target, and we can adjust the size of the patches in that target from an extremely large sampling to an extremely tiny sampling. And as a general rule, I like it somewhere in the middle. Now, what are we actually looking at with that sampling? Well, for those of you that grew up in Photoshop with 0 to 255, you'll notice that Lightroom does not have 0 to 255 and likely never will. And there's actually a good logical reason for that. As soon as we actually start talking about 0 to 255, we have to define a color space where that would be appropriate. And as color spaces change from, say, ProPhoto to Adobe 98 or sRGB, those numbers actually would change. So the engineers started thinking about a better way of dealing with color in Lightroom, and it's based on luminance, which is really what digital imaging is levels of luminance or luminosity. So the scale is a scale of 0 to 100. 0 being black with no detail. You can see I have some detail here. And 100 being a blown out highlight in essence, or white with no detail. So one of the neat little things that I find useful in Lightroom is that by running the sampler through the image, I can actually see if there's detail in places that I might not be able to determine automatically with my eye. And then yet another way of finally putting all this together, I'm going to intentionally whack this image out. And if I pick an area of white with detail, and again, we have a fairly wide latitude, but an area of white with detail, like the clouds, for example, I can click and, again, instantly neutralize the image. And that is just plain cool. Very, very easy to do. And that is white balance in a nutshell. I'm going to dock the white balance tool back in. And we'll move on now to exposure. And I want to show you, I'm going to pick a different image for this. I'll go to this one, which, by the way, probably you can't tell what that is. And I was actually just in Oslo, Norway, and the harbor was had oil in it, but it was also frozen. So what you're looking at is a little bit of oil on top of ice in the harbor. And I just happen to like this kind of stuff. So to use the next set of sliders here, exposure, going down 4 stops or going up 4 stops. But what you probably didn't know is that the correct way of using it, or the way of the idea of adjusting my highlights in essence, would be that if you hold down the Option key, so I'm going to hold down the Option key, and then I get in essence a visually rendered histogram here. And at the point where I begin to get color detail, that is my technically correct white point and or exposure. It may not be aesthetically exactly what I want, but it is very useful in finding the exact starting point. We also, I like to hit auto for a reason. I don't use auto when I import, but auto gives me a pretty good concept mathematically of how I shot. And you'll see on this case, I'm at 0, 0, 0, meaning I'm sort of dead on the money with my exposure. Now aesthetically, I actually probably like that opened up a little bit more. But technically, it meant I hit it on the target. And I find it very, very useful for photographers to shoot manually, take control of it, and then test themselves actually in Lightroom. Because if you find that on every single image you're getting this, or you're getting this, 2 or 3 stops or more, it's a great example of that you should go back to the drawing board because you're really off in your exposure. And it's a really great way of helping learn exposure by using Lightroom to judge your performance. We also have underneath that a recovery slider, and I don't know if this has any real blown out highlights, but the way we would use it is, well, actually, yes. So recovery can actually bring back detail in areas that are blown out. And again, the mystery key here is the Option key. So the way to technically use this is that if I hold down the Option key and I mouse down on recovery, as I move the slider to the right, you'll see the colors, in essence, disappear. Now, some of that is just actually reflectance off of water, but you can see that the areas that I'm actually recovering by moving that slider. And I wouldn't want to push it too far to the right. I'll definitely induce some things I don't like in the image, but very, very useful is to use that Option key. I want to switch to a different image for a minute. The next one is fill light, and fill light, very, very cool. Fill light is sort of like having an assistant with you holding up a fill card, filling in those shadows. So if I move the slider, and this is one of the ones that actually you need the Option key for, but by moving that to the right, I am able to fill in essence, especially in the eyes, without affecting the other regions of the image. So for me, probably somewhere right in here is just about perfect because I'm sort of filling in the eyes that are otherwise slightly shadowed in the eyes. Sorry. Black. The default in Lightroom is 5, and this is our shadow adjustment. And again, to use it correctly, hold down the Option key. You'll see if I start on the left, it's all white, and at the point where I first begin to get detail, right there, you start to see some yellow and black dots. That becomes my technically correct black point. A point of something to make a notice of is that the default is 5, and for most images, you're probably going to find it's around 3, give or take. And for those of you that are used to using software from some of the camera manufacturers, one of the things that that you typically hear is they will take a raw file and say that the software is typically better because it does a better job with noise. And if you actually look at what's going on in a lot of the other software, black clipping is actually set sometimes as high as 10. And if black is at 10, we're blocking up our shadows, and hence you wouldn't see noise as readily. So one of the things I actually like to do when I make a develop preset is I start out with my develop preset with black at 0. So I take control always of the blacks rather than let the default be 5. And again, for many images, the average is probably around 3. Brightness, the next slider, is one of the most misunderstood sliders in this module, and the internet is a fantastic place for good information and also a pretty amazing place for wrong information. And one of the things I recently read was something that sounded very, very logical, that and it explained that exposure darkens, exposure lightens, and that also brightness does the same thing. There it is darker, there it is brighter, with what seemed like a fairly logical explanation that brightness was a leftover legacy slider from the days of Photoshop. And while that sounds all well and good, that's not what it is at all. What it is in essence, exposure is adjusting our highlights, black is adjusting our shadows, and brightness is adjusting the tone of our midtones. And that's exactly what it's used for, and that's why it's in the order it's in. So highlights, shadows, and midtones. Contrast is exactly what it sounds like. Adjusting contrast, from negative contrast or exceedingly flat to very, very high contrast. And, it's fairly an aesthetic slider. It's one that, again, I would say that on most of your images, if you're always, always, always adjusting contrast, it's a pretty good indicator that you shot incorrectly, and a good, useful tool for understanding why you should be going back to the drawing board. Moving down, we have one of the photographer favorite sliders in the presence panel, and that's the clarity slider. Clarity is, in essence, mid-tone contrast. And as we increase mid-tone contrast, we increase, in essence, our perception, if you will, of sharpness. So if I were to slide this like this, the image appears much sharper. If I bring it down, the image appears much softer. And photographers typically love to bring clarity up to 50 is a number that a lot of photographers like. And again, there's really nothing wrong with it. What I will point out is that sometimes negative clarity is actually something that is quite useful, especially when we start talking with skin. If you take a female skin and you start using a brush, for example, which I'm going to get into a little later, some of the localized corrections, using negative clarity can give the appearance of much smoother skin. Also, sometimes for effect, clarity or negative clarity is very, very cool. So I'm going to show you an example here. This is clarity at quite high, at 68. This is in Hawaii. And if I move to the this virtual copy, you'll see that's clarity or negative clarity. And it's actually quite cool because in this case, negative clarity gives a very mystical feeling on the water, but my subject stays sharp. So again, that's the positive clarity and that's negative clarity. Very, very interesting to play with. All right, let me go back to a different image here.
Hey, Seth.
Yes.
There are just a few questions I wouldn't mind bringing up right now.
Okay.
First, there were a few people asking where you look to see what your zero exposure is.
Okay. So you hold down the Option key, and if I hold down the Option key and mouse down, you'll see right there that the whole screen is in essence black. As I move it to the right, right there in the dead center, you'll see a little bit of green. I'm going to actually back off, and right there, you'll see a little bit of green coming in, and that is actually my technically correct exposure. And some images is a little easier to tell than others, but you're looking for the beginning signs of some colored detail, not in a blown out highlight, but actual in the channels. And you can do that by holding down that Option key and moving the slider to the right.
Gotcha. And what about, do you ever find that with using the recovery tool that you get any sort of color shift?
If you really crank it out, you will actually get beyond just a color shift change. You can actually get some what looks like posterization and other things. And a lot of these sliders, you know, if you really push them to their limits, they're going to induce artifacting. But as a general rule, using recovery a little bit, or at least to the halfway point, is very useful when needed.
Gotcha. Cool. I think some people also just want to know.
And in fact, let me just try one thing here. I haven't tried it on this image, but I will just give an example here. Okay, so you can see those when I press the Option key, you can see all those blown out highlights. And as I move that recovery slider, we're recovering, in this case, probably about 70 or 80% right there of those blown out highlights. And that's really, I mean, again, that's where it really becomes useful. Again, one other image that I can try is this one. And let's let that load for a second here. And again, if I press down Option, well, there's really, it's actually all amazingly, even into the sun, the details there. You need a good example to show it, and I probably should have picked a better one. But
that's
anything
cool.
else, Brian, before
I think people are just also curious in terms of like what your defaults are, your default settings, how you set them.
Okay. Well, why don't I explain that now? So my look, if you will, is a look of Kodachrome, and to simulate Kodachrome, in order to do that, I set black to 0. I set saturation to about 15, and vibrance to about 17. And then one of the looks of Kodachrome was that it was a very contrasty film. So I also typically increase clarity to around 50. And then the other little things I'll do is in HSL, which we haven't gotten to yet, I'll increase very slightly red saturation and yellow saturation, about +5. I will add some sharpening. I will add lens corrections, and I will add a camera calibration. Once I have all those in there, on the left side, I choose the plus sign next to presets, and I create a preset based on those criteria, and then on import, that look can be applied. So moving down, clarity we covered. Vibrance, and let me just zero this out for a minute. Vibrance, actually I'm going to do saturation first. Saturation is exactly what it sounds like. Taking away saturation or adding saturation. And you'll notice that when we start to add excessive amounts of saturation, and this is a perfect example, you'll see how whacked out the color can actually get, and certainly induce many problems in terms of printing, if not even problems on screen. The vibrance slider is actually a very cool slider, because vibrance, and I guess in English the best way to explain it is vibrance allows colors to saturate that will saturate, but it's going to constrain the colors that are going to go out of gamut. So I can actually crank vibrance up fairly high, and you'll see the greens and you'll see some of the fur start to take on the look of saturation, but it's not going to get that same look as when we punch up saturation. Vibrance is also exceedingly useful for skin, because with portraiture, if you start to increase saturation, you very quickly start to get the look of an alcoholic, if you will. The skin starts going magenta and really takes on quite a look. Whereas if we use vibrance, we can actually start to increase saturation without having those same effects. Moving down, we have curves. And we have two kinds of curves here. We have a point curve, more or less a traditional Photoshop curve that we can get by clicking. And again, it's so obvious. You click on the little point here, and now we actually have points in the curve that we can adjust. Or we have the more traditional Lightroom set of curves. And in the Lightroom set of curves, the image is broken down into quarter tones. And I have my highlights, my lights, my darks, and my shadows. We have what's called a targeted adjustment tool. That's this little guy right here. And I can place that over the image, and wherever I have it, you can see the point of the image that I'm activating. So now I'm on the highlights. You'll see now I'm on my darks. Here I'm on my darks, and here I'm on my lights. If I want to open up my lights, for example, I can mouse down with my mouse and then use my up or down arrow key, and I can actually open up the lights, or I can bring down the lights, if you will, without really affecting the other parts of the image. Very, very, very cool to have this targeted adjustment tool. It works quite well. One little tip is that one of the notorious things about shooting a sun, for example, as in this image, or shooting into the sun, is a lot of times on digital, the sun looks like you put a quarter or $half down on the sensor, and you get all this magenta fringing, and there's no detail around it at all. And a useful little trick is that these on the curve, we can actually peg, if you will, these quarter tones. So if I were to take, for example, the highlights and peg them to 90, by moving my highlights, I'm now only adjusting the upper 90% of luminance. So I can sort of bring down the corona around the sun, if you will, without affecting other parts of the image. And again, to zero everything out, we always just double click on a slider, and that will zero things out. Let me go to a different image for a minute. I'm going to go over to this one. And the next panel down, let me just close the basic panel and close the tone curve. And we're going to open up HSL. HSL stands for hue, meaning the color, saturation, meaning the saturation of a given color, and luminance, meaning the brightness of a given color. And I am going to overdo something here to give you an example of one of the things that's very useful in HSL. And that happens to be that I am a firm believer in not using filters on my lens shooting digital. One of the reasons is most screw-in filters don't have a true meniscus curve, so light simply bounces off the sensor, bounces off the inside of that filter, and then we get all these weird little specular highlights. The other thing is that people will use something like a polarizing filter, and to remove reflection, there's really no easy way of doing that in Photoshop, so a polarizing filter is actually quite useful. But to make a sky bluer, there's actually a far better way, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate here, and I'm going to overdo it so you all get to see exactly the effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Hue first, and I'm going to use my targeted adjustment tool, this little guy right here. I'm going to put it into the blue area of the image. I'm going to mouse down. By using my up or down arrow key, you'll see that as I increase blue, you'll see that I'm also affecting blue and aqua. And if I go down, I'm again also affecting blue and aqua. And I'm doing it disproportionately because I'm actually analyzing what the colors are in the components here and adjusting those accordingly. So I'm going to actually go slightly positive, about 10 on the blue. I'm going to go to saturation next. And again, I'm going to overdo it so you can really see the difference. And I'm going to increase blue saturation. And then I'm going to go to luminance, and I'm going to lower blue luminance. And what we just created is the exact look, if you will, of a polarizing filter. That is the before, and that is the after. And again, one little tip of seeing the before and after, I like to use the \/ key, the key underneath the delete key, which will give you a before and after point of view or reference. So very, very neat to be able to control independently both hue, saturation, and luminance, and really bring on some fairly dramatic, very simple changes to an image based on the colors that are present in that image. We also have the ability to create a black and white. And when I say black and white, what's very interesting is that we're actually creating a 16-bit Pro Photo black and white. So if I click on black and white here, and I hit auto, we can have a pretty unique black and white, and a really, really neat to have control over all of these channels. So for example, if I now take the blue slider, you can watch what happens with the clouds as we go from, plus 90, and as we start to go negative, I mean, just making those clouds completely pop out. And very, very neat to have control over really almost all the tone in the image with a slider for black and white. I think poor old Ansel Adams would just roll over completely if he knew that we could do part of the zone system with simply a series of sliders. But very, very cool to have that as an option. While I have this particular image opened, I'm going to show something else before I go further down, and that is in the localized corrections, which are up here. And again, all of these, and I will get to them, are global, meaning we are affecting the entire image. What we have up here are local corrections that are affecting only part of the image. So the first thing that's actually quite useful is the cropping tool. And in this case, I was very impressed by the color. This was an Anguilla. And for the life of me, I didn't get the horizon straight. So we have an angle tool. That's this little guy. And I'm going to simply trace the angle that's out. I'm going to release my mouse and hit return, and we straighten out the horizon line. Very, very, very cool. Then I'm going to open up my gradient and graduated filter. And the graduated filter, we can do some very neat things. We can basically apply the look of a gradient, and then we can even apply gradients on top of gradients and control clarity and sharpness and color. So the way to do this is first I'm going to look at the image and sort of assess in my mind what I want to do. And I'm going to want to create a gradient that lowers exposure a little bit. And I'm going to want to add some blue. And now I put my mouse over the image. And if I hold the Shift key down, I can apply this gradient perpendicular to the horizon. So there's dropping a gradient down, which is also another way of affecting the blue. And now I can edit that gradient. So I can lower the exposure. I could increase saturation. I can even change the color. And a neat little tip is that I can either sample color from within the palette, or if I mouse down and drag the eyedropper into the image, I can actually sample color from within the actual image. So I can sample color right from within the sky. Once I like what I have, I hit return, and that sets the gradient. The letter H key will show the pin or the setting for that gradient. I can always click on that and re-edit that gradient. And then I can set a new gradient if I so desire. So on top of this, I could even darken the sky further with a second gradient. Whoops. And we can edit gradients at a later date by clicking on the pin and editing the pin, or just to show that the design team has some sense of humor, we can always click on the pin and hit the delete key, and you get a little puff of smoke, a little sound, and the pin goes away altogether. We also have a set of brushes. in the localized corrections. And again, with the brushes, we can paint in and edit again later. And we can use brushes and gradients together. And if we do something here, like let me just bring the sky down a little bit. And we're going to make the brush a little larger, just to show you an example. And I'm going to totally overdo it. And what we have, which is also quite cool, is the ability that the letter O key will actually show the mask. In this case, I have auto masking on, so it's automatically looking for these edges, which is quite cool. And then the Alt key, I can actually subtract from the mask. So very, very useful to see what the mask is. And then O reveals the mask. And again, the letter H is the pin. That was what we did. We can click on that pin at a later time and hit delete and delete the pin. I could spend hours on both the graduated filter and the brush, but there's still a lot more for me to cover, so I just wanted to touch upon those. Moving down further, let me close this. We go down and we have split toning. And split toning, actually just make this black and white again for a second. And we'll hit auto. And split toning is one of those features that is not so well documented in how to use it, because if I simply start playing with the sliders and I do this, you see all that change? If anybody does see that dramatic change, please let me know, because I certainly don't see it at all. The way to use it is we want to use the Option key. So if I want to sort of give the look of a sepia tone, for example, if I hold down the Option key, I can get to those sepia tones now, somewhere in here. I release the Option key, and then I use saturation to affect the saturation of that tone. And then I could cool my shadows, if you will, by doing the same thing. Press down the Option key, go to my blues, and then use saturation. And then we have a balance slider, so I can actually go between the cooling off the image, if you will, and warming the image, and or at any point in between, which is also, again, quite useful. Moving down, let me close split toning for a minute, and let me go to a different image here. I think we'll go to this hippo. Probably the most misunderstood, or well, maybe not misunderstood, yeah, misunderstood tool is the detail, or how we deal with sharpening. And a couple little notations about this. Number one, in order to see the effects, we have to be at 1:1. So I'm going to go to 1:1. The second part is that we have to decide where we're actually going to judge sharpening. And we want to judge sharpening in an area where we have some high frequency or lots of detail, and in areas where we have what we call light and dark contours. So it's fairly useless for me to look up in the sky to judge sharpening, or down here in the water. It makes much more sense to look at some of the areas like the eye, the area around the teeth, and this area for judging sharpening. I then have another little tool here that'll give me a close-up of a specific area if I want to look at a specific area in the little box. So I'm going to just pick this area around this lovely tooth. To use the sliders, yes, we can just go back and forth, but what again makes much more sense is by pressing down the Option key and going into a black and white rendering. Now I can see that the image is soft, and here I can totally see reticulation in the image. And what we're looking for is we want to make a judgment call before we have any reticulation and before it gets over sharpened. So again, that's 0, That's at 150. I can see lots of reticulation. The correct amount for this is somewhere right in about here, where I'm beginning to get good detail without getting the reticulation. Radius is typically going to be somewhere between 0.8 and 1.8. And what I like to do is, the easiest way is to start looking for outline detail. So this is at 0.5. This is at 0.3. You can clearly see, or rather 3.0, and that's at 0.5. And I'm beginning to really look for where I begin to get definition in most of those edges and outlines. And in this image, it's somewhere around 0.9.
Hey, Seth.
Yes, sir.
There's a slight lag between the audio and the video.
Oh, I'm sorry. These
no,
are
no problem.
highly intensive processing here, so it's probably tasking my processor and the internet. I'll slow down a little bit.
Thanks.
The next one is detail. And again, I'm going to press down the option slider. And as I was joking with Brian beforehand, when all else fails, simply use the option key. So if I hold down option and mouse down on the slider, you'll see that at 0, I see some of the outline detail, but it's kind of tough to see. And as I move to 100, I clearly see the reticulation and most of that edge detail. And what I'm really looking for is a point where I begin to get that edge detail without that reticulation. And again, in an image like this, it's probably somewhere right about here. And the last slider in detail is really one of the most critical, and one of the ones that people simply don't pay attention to, and that's masking. And the idea of masking is, where are we going to apply our sharpening? And we want to apply our sharpening typically to our edges. We want to reduce halos. We want to, so what's neat about this is that, again, if I press down the option key, at 0, we are applying sharpening everywhere. And at 100, I am applying sharpening only to my highlight edges. And what I like to do is I want to adjust it so that most of my edge detail is actually showing. So I'm looking at where I start to get some of that texture, if you will, in the skin of the hippo and most of the outlines. And on this image, it's right around this point. And that's going to really help me emphasize the texture, if you will, in the hippo and in the teeth, etc., etc. The next sliders down are noise reduction. The default is 25. And for me, that's actually quite heavy-handed, because many of my images, the majority of my images, I actually try to shoot at ISO 100, so I really don't have a lot of noise. And I'm not sure I actually do have an example, but I'd have to go search high and low for a good example of noise. Let me see if I can quickly find one. Well, I don't want to waste too much time. So let me just see if I can pick up some noise here in the shadows. I'll be able to simulate this anyways. So if I were to increase exposure a bit more, we should be able to pick up some noise in those deep shadows. Yeah, you can sort of see it. And we can apply noise reduction. So there is removing the color noise. And again, this really isn't the best image. And then we also have the ability to remove luminance noise. The color noise will typically look similar to little red, green, and blue dots. And luminance noise looks like almost like reticulation. It's crunchy black and white pixels. Let me just try one other image out of curiosity and see if we can find any in this one. And even, I mean, the cameras have gotten so good. Even in here, in my shadows, I don't see any real noise as much as I'd like to be able to see to show you how to get rid of it. Okay, moving forward, the next one is actually one of the coolest. And we have the ability to apply lens corrections now in Lightroom. This is new in Lightroom 3. Let me close the detail panel a minute. And the way to use it is, first of all, hopefully that your lens is in the database. But I can choose Enable Profile Corrections and then choose Auto. And you'll notice in this case, why is it not finding my lens? Very interesting. Let's pick this one. There we go. So this is a Canon 14 millimeter. And if I turn the correction off, you can see sort of snap in. And if I turn it on, it instantly corrects the image. What's very neat is what we are correcting. So if I go to manual for a minute, we actually have the ability to correct distortion this way or this way. So bending in or bending out, if you will. We can correct for vertical distortion. So tilting this way or tilting this way. We have horizontal, so bending it this way or bending it this way, as well as rotate and scale. So really quite advanced and very, very cool. And I want to show you one really good example. Let me just go back here to Profile. And I just want to reset this for a second. And I want to show you a really neat example, actually, which is this image. And without the lens corrections, and one of the problems that we actually encountered in Antarctica is that every time we actually shot this very bright ice against a dark background, we had very sort of classic magenta fringing around all of the highlights, and made the images very interesting, but not very useful in terms of printing. And what's totally cool here is that if I just click on the lens corrections, I instantly eliminate, I not only correct for the distortion and the barrel distortion and the chromatic aberration, but I also immediately eliminate that magenta fringing. So very, very, very cool to have that as an option. Let me back out of this for a second. And we're starting to wind down the hour. The other little things I want to point out, and then I have sort of a little special treat for you as well. Camera calibration is something that I find very, very useful. And I use X-Rite's Color Checker Passport. And what I'll do with that is actually make a profile. And when I make that profile, I can use the Option key, and I'm going to show you this. So I photographed a Color Checker Passport, use the Option key, and I choose Set Default. And what's very neat is that I can actually set a calibration for each camera serial number at a specific ISO. So just a little note, and again, this is part of a workflow. I don't shoot at 100 different ISOs. I typically shoot at ISO 100, ISO 640, and maybe ISO 1000. And by doing that, I can take each one of my camera bodies and make a profile based on that those three ISOs. What's very neat is that then when I import, I automatically apply the appropriate profile for that given image. So again, you'll see here that I'm actually applying this one called Miami 5D Mark II at ISO 100. And very, very useful and very, very handy in terms of workflow to set a series of presets and then apply those during import. So before I close out, I want to show you one other thing today. And let me just go to the library for a minute. And this is sort of a special little treat. So On1 has announced a new product called Perfect Layers, and it is really awesome. And what it allows you to do is basically utilize layers, if you will, in Lightroom and or Photoshop. So I'm going to give you a very quick, just little demo of a very simple part of it. I am also going to be doing a webinar on this exact topic on next Monday, which Brian can fill everybody in about. But I want to show you something because this is really quite cool. So my original in this case are these two little girls that I shot last week in Norway. And then I've made a virtual copy. To create a virtual copy, we go Photo, Create Virtual Copy. And I'm not duplicating the image. I'm actually duplicating the metadata, if you will. So I have a black and white rendering of that from the same set of metadata. I'm going to take both of these, and I'm going to go to Perfect Layers. And these are on raw files, and this is all beta stuff. So hopefully everything will work just perfect. And then what's really neat is I'm going to basically combine part of the color with part of the black and white. So if I want to, for example, add a little color to the faces, very, very neat that I can choose Paint Out. Let me just lower the opacity a little bit. Go and I'll pick a brush here. And I can just add a little bit of color, if you will, into the faces, in essence, the same way that we would have layers in Photoshop. And really, really cool to be able to combine multiple images and then do things by working on, you know, the different layers and have control over painting in, painting out, opacity, brush size, and really, I've had a ton of fun playing with this. Very, very cool, and more to come. And that's about all for today, Brian. I'm going to turn this back over for you. We can answer some additional questions and turn it back to you.
Sounds good. I will take control right now and show my screen. So there are a few things I'd like to go over before we send you off. First, just really quickly, I wanted to show you Seth's website. I had mentioned earlier you can basically join any of these workshops that Seth offers if you go to d-65.com, www.d-65.com. Also, before I kind of go through my final slides, of which you'll see this URL listed again, there are, I don't know if a lot of you may necessarily know this, but excuse me, at On1 we offer a bunch of free Lightroom presets. We have for a little while now. So if you go to on1software.com and then you go to Products and then scroll down to the second to last one, it's called Free Products. When you go in there, just scroll down and you'll see presets for Lightroom. We also have presets for Aperture and presets for Camera Raw. So just go into the Lightroom option, you can see Learn More, and then there are 190 or over 190 different presets that we give away. So by all means, enjoy them. And I know, Seth, there were a lot of people who were really interested in your Kodachrome presets. So presets are just one of those fun things. It's just you know, it's a snapshot of your develop module in a sense. If I were to be, you know, just really kind of bring it to a very superficial or high level, that's what a preset is. So what I'm going to do is there was actually one quick question, Seth, about reticulation.
Sure.
I didn't know if you just can give a basic idea when you were talking about sharpening.
Yeah. So let me just look at a different image for a second here. We'll see if I can get a really good example of it.
I'll make. Do you want me to make you presenter again?
Well, let me talk through it, and then we'll see if I need to be presenter again.
Sure.
So, reticulation looks. I guess you could say it looks like a very accentuated grain, And you'll, you know, one of the downsides of sharpening is that if you don't go to black and white, you just use those sliders. Photographers love things sharp. I mean, we typically love to have everything very, very sharp. But if you over sharpen, you start to add some downsides, one of which can be inducing halos. The other one, and halos, you're literally going to have like a fuzzy edge, or you know, looks like a rainbow almost around the edge of an image. The other thing is reticulation. The reticulation really looks like too much grain, if you will. And when I'm using those sliders, what I'm looking for is the point where the image is sharp, but I am not getting that accentuated reticulation.